Peace. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you back into another edition of the File Playland. As always, I'm your file player. Laid up in my room, getting ready to go to bed, in the sunlight. And I actually got jolted with excitement, pause, um, from listening to my elder statesman, Blood Boxing. And he made a video aptly titled Errol Spence is a Bitch Part 2. Um, I actually did two videos about Errol Spence, partially earlier today, and thought it'd be deserving to follow it up with another one after being invigorated by the words of Blood Boxing. Um, I consider Blood Boxing a faraway mentor. I've never spoken to him personally, but I consider him almost as a compass because a lot of the things that he feels, I feel 99% of the time the same way. And I don't say 99%, because I disagree with him most of the time. I probably say 99% because I don't get to listen to every single thing he says, but usually when he's on, I'm in 100% agreement with him. Um, you know, blood boxing to me is a remnant of a dying breed of boxing fans, if you will. A lot of the things that he says, though, it's like I almost forgot them until, and he's there to remind me, and he had a lot of scathing words for Errol Spence Jr. And as bad as it sounded, I mean, like to a lot of people that wish well upon these fighters and whatnot, I agree with 100% what he was saying. But I'll get right into it though. I mean, he made a lot of good points. And the reason I'm making my own video too is because Bud Crawford, a lot of fanfare has been attributed to the fact that he um in last night's fight between Virgil Ortiz and Maurice Hooker, in while he was in the crowd, because he had Virgil calling out his name prior to this fight. There was also Errol Spence in the crowd too, hiding, seemingly with a boonie hat on, and you know, um, looking ridiculous. Little entourage of cornballs that he rolls with, and Bud Crawford went to where he was being called out on, and Bud Crawford also went to Errol Spence's last fight, and Errol Spence acted like a true hoe and says, "Hold on, making a video, love," and said, "What's he?" When Errol Spence reacted to Bud Crawford being at his match, saying, "What's he doing here?" I mean, newsflash, dipshit. He's trying to make a fight with you, seemingly, and you're doing everything you can um, to act like he's not there. And he did the same thing yesterday. I mean, the interview that Bud Crawford did with the Zone. I mean, he mentioned the fact that the fight with Errol Spence is history, and I think it's largely due to the fact that he's disenfranchised with the supposed negotiations that are happening with Errol Spence. And one thing that Bud made it clear, like, is regardless of whether you think Errol Spence is the A side compared to Bud Crawford, which I don't think he is. I think neither one of them is A side. I think they both don't have much to write home about. But Errol Spence is acting like he's this top billing dude. I mean, like, I can name probably 10 fighters that have more clout than Errol Spence does. Teofimo Lopez at this track would probably have more clout than Errol Spence in a year. Tank Davis probably is scratching at Errol Spence's clout factor, and he ain't even fighting nobody. Errol Spence acts like he walks into a room and everybody just stops. If I see Errol Spence in person, I'm definitely gonna talk shit to him. You know, the but these dudes act like they're doing these big moves, i.e. Errol Spence and a lot of his hardcore fan base. When Errol Spence, I mean, if he has a Toyota commercial like in locally in Texas, I mean that's a lot. Like, they probably overpaid, you know, uh three or 4,000 or a used Yaris to get him to do a commercial. Errol Spence is no celebrity. I mean, like, and a lot of dudes treat him like, when he talks, the world listens. I mean, like, one, the dude barely talks. Two, when he does talk, barely about Bud Crawford. Like, and that's what everybody wants to hear. Nobody wants to hear that he's um gonna fight Ugas. I think people should be disappointed at the fight that he's gonna fight Ugas. But you got a lot of dudes that celebrate the fact that Ugas has a belt that was gifted to him for fighting Abel Ramos, I guess, and that Errol Spence is gunning for that belt. I mean, no shit. Like, what's the surprise there? Um, to me, I mean, like, as much as unification with Bud Crawford would be nice, but I think fighting Bud Crawford next would be 100 times better. You know, the fact that Ugas got a belt, I mean, like, and you acquire that belt from Ugas by beating him, somebody who's been beat 4 times, that's no feat. Like, that's zero. That should be no hold up to you fighting Bud Crawford. But the truth is that he doesn't want to fight Bud Crawford. Errol Spence has mentioned Bud Crawford way less than Mayweather mentioned Pacquiao, or Pacquiao mentioned Mayweather when they were when a lot of people were getting frustrated at that fight not being made, and at the fact that that neither fighter talked about each other much. At least they would mention each other here and there. Errol Spence and Bud Crawford to a degree, but much more Errol Spence is allergic to mentioning Bud Crawford's name, and Bud Crawford suffers from the same too. But at least Bud Crawford addressed the situation yesterday and said that the fight is history, and that's probably like not due to the fact that Errol Spence is scared of. Bud Crawford is shook from Errol Spence because he's not. It's that Errol Spence is abroad and he's being enabled. Meanwhile, this dude is probably 2 steps from being broke. These dudes, aren't touching 10 million, and I don't even give a shit. I mentioned Claudia in my last video. As far as having big events, just a couple decades ago, 1 decade ago, in what is now probably a golden era compared to today's era. Today's era is a fucking granite era of boxing. You know, but I'm pretty sure that Claudia made more than what Errol Spence has made his whole career. And Claudia wasn't even like a top 30 fighter of that era. You know, Margarito has made more than Errol Spence, guaranteed. Margarito has a lot more respect in the game, in spite of him cheating, than Errol Spence. But if we keep pumping him up and making him seem like he has a huge negotiation foothold hanging over Bud Crawford, that fight's never gonna be made. And I've already said this many times that the fight won't be made. A lot of people don't believe me. Even if the fight gets made 2 years from now when they're at 154, it's gonna lose all its luster because they're gonna have a couple people that could probably whoop their asses at 154 as is. So I mean, like, I want that fight now. It's not. I don't want it to be built up. And I don't think it's being built up, frankly. And if it is being built up, it's a shitty plan. Like, I think the fight is losing its luster. It's not being like, there's nothing about that fight that makes me want to see it more today than I did a month ago. And I think a lot of people are starting to feel that way. Like, that fight is just ass. Like, or these dudes are just ass, especially Errol Spence. And those the Zone crew that filmed Bud Crawford saying that, why didn't Errol Spence hop on the camera? And people are gonna say, oh well, he only does interviews with the PBC. You should be begging for people to do interviews with you. There is no boxing media right now. Boxing media is limited to a couple of YouTube channels and a flicker of a mention sometimes on ESPN when it comes to certain white fighters or non-black fighters. But for anybody to be interviewing you or even noticing you is a miracle. You should be kissing their feet um for any of these boxes. These dudes are nobodies. But people want to act like Errol Spence is a better nobody than Bud Crawford. And Blood made a good point as far as these dudes celebrating the fact that Errol Spence has 300,000 pay-per-view buys in some of his fights. Errol Spence has 3,000 pay-per-views in one of his fights. There ain't no way Errol Spence sold 300,000 pay-per-views against Charlotte Porter. There ain't no way Errol Spence sold 300,000 pay-per-views against Danny Garcia. That's a lie. Errol Spence sold 300,000 maybe plus versus Mikey Garcia, and that was largely based off Mikey Garcia. Look at that fight yesterday in Texas. There was straight up Mexico. And Maurice Hooker is a Texas fighter. Nobody was cheering for him. And that I'm pretty sure there's a little bit of a bleed over there, if not a lot of a bleed over, of those Mexican fans that were probably rooting for Mikey Garcia, that were that were probably rooting for Virgil Ortiz, a much lesser draw than Mikey Garcia, that were filling up the Cowboy Stadium for that Errol Spence versus Mikey Garcia fight. Errol Spence ain't no draw. Like, Errol Spence would be recognized by a handful of people in New York, Times Square, if you walk down those streets without a mask on. He's a nobody. And hopefully, these dudes get a reality check. Make a couple of bad purchases next year, please. So you could be struggling for cash, and force yourself into making these fights. Boxing's so dead right now, it's not even funny. The only reason I'm coming on to these videos now to talk about boxing is to talk about boxing's demise. And so that could hopefully bring these wages down that these boxers make for fighting other nobodies, and to maybe motivate them to take bigger risks. And the biggest culprit in all that stuff of a guy who's touting himself as, or gassing his own self up, or having a couple dudes gas him up to thinking that he's top billing, and who's being a real broad about taking on fights. Number one in that category, Errol Spence. Let me know what you guys think, man. Hate this dude.